The views expressed on Science for the People are not necessarily the views of this station, its affiliates, sponsors, or advertisers.
This week on Science for the People, backed by popular demand, we're taking a second look at Steve Silberman's book Neurotribes, looking again at the history and future of autism. Welcome to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell, and I'm joined by Steve Silberman, who has covered science and cultural affairs for Wired and other national magazines for more than 20 years. He's joined us today for part 2 of a conversation about his new book, Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. Welcome back, Steve.
Hey, thank you, Desiree. It's great to be back here.
So obviously I just couldn't leave you alone, sir, because I love this book and your interview. And apparently so did our listeners, because there was a clamoring, I say, for part 2.
Oh, good.
So,
excellent.
So the last time you were here, I think what we covered mainly was the history of the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders. But there was a lot more that I wanted to talk to you about. And one of those things was the rise of parents' organizations and how that was sort of a turning point in how we view autism. So maybe can you walk us through that?
Sure. Well, the parents' organizations were in reaction to the prevailing belief among clinicians that autism was caused by bad parenting. So that was probably the most damaging aspect of the legacy of Leo Kanner, who was the man who took the credit for discovering autism, although, as I talk about in my book, I believe the true discoverer of what we now call the autism spectrum was Hans Asperger in Vienna in the mid-1930s. But what happened was that Leo Kanner came out with a paper in 1943 describing 11 patients and sort of really setting in stone the clinical picture of autism. You know, it was, for the most part, a very beautiful paper, carefully observed. And as I revealed in Neurotribes, one of the reasons why the quality of the observations was so high was that Kanner had, helping him do those observations, George Frankl, who had actually been Hans Asperger's chief diagnostician at the Children's Clinic in Vienna. So, in a sense, Kanner had the most qualified possible person doing his clinical observations for him when he saw his first 2 autistic patients. When Kanner first saw a guy named Donald Triplett, or Donald T, in the famous paper, he didn't really know what to make of him, so he sent him to George Frankl over at the Child Study Home. Kanner had rescued George Frankl from the Holocaust, ended up becoming his main collaborator for the next couple of years as he, quote-unquote, discovered autism. Kanner's paper very skillfully wove the observations by Frankl at the Child Study Home, which was sort of an annex of Johns Hopkins. And there was also another clinical observer named Eustacia Cameron. Kanner came out with this paper. And even though later he would say that it made a big splash, in fact, it was almost entirely ignored. It got noticed by one journal that did a sort of Reader's Digest of the most important studies that year. You know, not coincidentally, the guy who said that Kanner's paper was one of the most important papers written that year was the father of a young girl who was in Kanner's original paper. That also hasn't been known until now. But that paper came out. It did not make a big splash. It was read by, a few of Kanner's peers and whatnot, but it really didn't make a big splash until about 3 years later. Kanner gave a presentation that ended up getting covered by Time magazine, in which he blamed autism on cold, unemotional parenting. The phrase that sort of passed into pop culture was refrigerator mothers, but Kanner was also very critical of, you could say refrigerator fathers, people who were so involved in their career that they didn't really have time to offer love and nurturance for their children. So this did 2 things. It attracted a tremendous amount of attention to Leo Kanner's work. And so suddenly he became sort of one of the first celebrity psychiatrists in America. And so he was called to comment upon various things. The other thing that it did that was catastrophic for autistic people and their families was that it made the generally accepted treatment protocol for autism institutionalization, because that would remove the child from the allegedly toxic psychological environment of the family. These kids basically went into psych wards for adults, because there was no such thing as an autism ward. The children disappeared into the institutions. Meanwhile, the parents were highly stigmatized. I spoke to many older parents who had been told by their psychiatrist or pediatrician to never mention the child's name again, to quietly remove the child's photos from the family albums, and just get on with their lives. And that was allegedly, better for both the parents and the children. Well, of course, it was horrible for everyone. And one of the things that it did was that it made the parents of autistic children incredibly isolated. They were already isolated because autism was mistakenly believed to be so rare, but they couldn't even, talk to anyone else they could have possibly found that had similar challenges with their child or had the grief of having put a child in an institution. Basically, if you were the parent of an autistic child, that was tantamount to confessing that you yourself were mentally ill. So it was an incredibly stigmatizing situation. Not only that, but the clinicians did not want the parents having anything to do with the children's treatment. I mean, the children, were already put in state hospitals for one, but also the parents weren't even supposed to be visiting their own children. Like, it was considered bad for the children, for the parents to visit. So the parents had this really incredible load of stigma and grief. And that started to change when parents basically started rebelling against that view. And the first parent to rebel against that view in America was a guy named Bernard Rimland. He was sort of universally known in the autism community eventually as Uncle Bernie. He was a big, affectionate, Jewish bear of a guy with a beard eventually. But when he was a young psychologist working for the Navy, his specialty was sort of human resources. So he didn't know anything about autism. He and his wife, Gloria, had a child named Mark. And Mark at first seemed to be a kind of a prodigy. His language came early. He seemed to be very, very alert in the nursery. And they thought, oh, this is great. He's amazing. But Gloria noticed, even before he left the maternity hospital, that he cried a lot. And in fact, he cried constantly. And, once they took him home, they realized that he had a set of challenges that they were not predicting and that were very, very difficult to handle. For instance, if Gloria so much as shampooed her hair, Mark would cry until it looked the way it usually did. And in fact, caring for Mark was so exhausting that Gloria, after really a couple of years, asked a neighbor to help her babysit, basically, or to babysit for her while she went out. And so Gloria went out for a little while. And when she came back, both the babysitter and Mark were on the floor crying. So Mark was very difficult to raise. He would also injure himself. He would bang his head against the walls of his crib until he had a bruise. And the only thing that seemed to calm him down, it's actually really sweet that the Rimlands thought of all these ways to calm him down and to sort of adapt his world so that he was more comfortable. For instance, they discovered that if they pushed his stroller back and forth over a broomstick, that it would kind of soothe him. Like there was something about the repetitive motion and slight jostling that soothed him. So they had no idea what was going on, and this was particularly difficult for Bernie because he was a psychologist. So he started reading around, and what did he discover? Well, he discovered that he and Gloria were allegedly responsible for this condition. In fact, they found the word autism in an old textbook that had been stored in the garage, and it was clear that Mark was autistic, but that came along with this official explanation that parents were to blame. And they knew they loved Mark. They were very affectionate. So it was Bernard thought it was impossible that they had caused it, but this stigma was so pervasive that Gloria, who hardly ever gives interviews, but she gave me an interview, and it was really a moving and wonderful experience. But she told me that, after years of not going out because they were caring for Mark, they finally went out with another couple, and they were having a good time, Gloria thought, when all of a sudden the wife and the other couple turned to her and said, you just don't seem like that kind of person. And Gloria said, what kind of person? And she said, the kind of person who would do that to your child. And so, Gloria was heartbroken, and they never saw each other again. So that's how pervasive the stigma was. So finally, what happened was Bernie wrote a book, and he did it by a book called Infantile Autism. And he did it by entering a contest, believe it or not, because there were no publishers that were going to publish a book by a non-expert on this allegedly very, very rare condition. So he submitted, he wrote a manuscript. He became obsessed while he was writing it. He literally lived in libraries. Like Gloria told me that one day, Bernie came back from, I think it was, New Orleans, a weekend in New Orleans, and he looked really thin and drawn. And Gloria said, well, did you eat? And he said, no, I had a guard lock me into this medical school library for the weekend, and all they had there was chicken soup that came out of a machine. So, he basically tried to read everything that had been written about autism. And back then, you still could actually have that ambition. Now, having tried more recently for my book, I have to say it's a lot harder to try to read everything that had ever been written about autism. But back then, he thought he could, and he actually engaged a team of translators from the Navy to help him translate because some of the stuff had been written in German. So anyway, Bernie wrote this book, submitted it to this very well-esteemed publishing company. They had a blind panel of judges choose it without knowing who the author was, so there couldn't be any prejudice in the judging. Bernie won. They published the book, and Bernie thought that it would mostly appeal to clinicians, basically. And so one of the things that he did was he came up with a questionnaire that he put at the back of the book. That was basically a screening questionnaire for autism. And much to Bernie's surprise, and in fact, Gloria told me initial horror, what happened was Bernie had included his address in the questionnaire. And like a week after the book came out, Bernie started getting all these questionnaires that had been torn out of the book by parents who had filled them out. And so immediately Bernie recognized that there was this population of parents who were desperate to find accurate information about autism that didn't blame them. Because what Bernie did was he overturned the then completely mainstream theory that parents were responsible for their children's autism. He just demolished it with information, with data. And so parents were so desperate to hear both accurate information about autism and also information about autism that didn't make them the villains in the story, because there were already books out that blamed them. So Bernie started getting these questionnaires, and he started to feel like, I've got to do something for these people, because, he was one of them. He and Gloria were parents, and there were all these other parents. Apparently, there were parents all over the country that were in the same state of extreme isolation and stigma and, desperate for more information, desperate to talk to other parents. In fact, Bernie didn't even identify himself as an autism parent in that book. And in fact, he didn't identify Mark in several of the anecdotes in the book, but it was Mark. But anyway, so what he did was he ended up getting in touch with another parent named Ruth Christ Sullivan. And Ruth Christ Sullivan had a son named Joe, who was sort of autistic in many classic ways. What was wonderful is that Ruth Christ Sullivan had a background as a community organizer. So, she told me she's very elderly now, but she's still an extremely spunky lady. I think she's in her late 80s by now. She still walks a mile every day. Like, she shamed me, I'll tell you. But she's still sharp as a tack. And she told me, the first time I held elected office, I was in 7th grade, she said. And then she became a student nurse. in the deep South, like at the most, intensely racist time in American history. And she called for a motion to integrate the Louisiana Nurses Association, which she was able to successfully pass unanimously. And her mother was an early feminist, so that was a role model for her. So basically, Ruth Chris Sullivan didn't take any you-know-what, And so she had already, in a sense, started organizing autism parents because she, when Joe was diagnosed, she took him to see some kind of a specialist, and she ended up being told by the specialist that she should be in a nervous mothers group or something like that, some condescending, group for these women who had allegedly, turned their kids autistic, basically. And so what she did, she's such a wonderful woman. I'm so glad she's still alive and thriving. But what she did was, when they're waiting for this clinician to come in, she passed around a secret note to the other women in the room that said basically after we get out of here, let's, why don't we just meet on our own so we could just talk, So she did that. And Bernie turned out to be kind of the perfect ally for her because Bernie had, sort of cred as a psychologist. He'd written this book that was instantly recognized as the best book ever written on the subject to that point in history, actually. In fact, the only right book that had been written on the subject to that point in history, because it didn't blame parents. So Bernie and Ruth started conspiring about, okay, well, why don't we create a community? Because Bernie really wanted to, sort of communicate with other parents to find out what was working. Bernie, was working for the kids. Bernie also had, by that point, teamed up with Ivar Lovaas, a psychologist at UCLA. Now, Ivar Lovaas invented what's called ABA, or Applied Behavior. Well, he didn't invent ABA. ABA stands for Applied Behavior Analysis. It's a behaviorist way of training people to do things. And so what Lovaas did was he applied ABA to autism in order to train autistic kids to do the simple tasks of self-care that, were necessary, like learning how to brush your teeth. He would break down the task into these very small units, and then he would repeatedly train the child. Now, Lovaas, he may have had good intentions, but he was not entirely a good guy, I have to say. And in fact, the more that I hear about him over the years, the less I think he was a good guy. But, ABA is still the most widely accepted early intervention for autism. It's very, very controversial among autistic self-advocates. We can talk about why later. But basically, what Lovaas did was he would either apply a reward if the child did something, that Lovaas wanted the child to do, like maybe a little M&M or a raisin or something. But where Lovaas sort of embraced the dark side was that he also used punishment.
Right.
So he would even slap the children, and eventually it escalated to the point where he was building electrified rooms that, these children would be standing in bare feet on electrical grids. And, if the child was told to hug one of the experimenters, if the child did not, quickly, run across the room and hug the experimenter, the child would get shocked through their feet. And these were very painful shocks. So basically, Lovaas was treating these children like rats in Skinner boxes, more or less. He had a very dehumanized way of looking at his young patients. In fact, he even said that they weren't human yet. He said that you had to build a person inside the autistic shell by using this repetitive training. So, but Bernie and Lovaas had already teamed up. One of the main things that Bernie was disturbed by when Mark was growing up was his self-injurious behavior, battering his head against a crib and stuff. And so Lovaas said that he could train kids not to do that anymore. Now, it turns out if you go back and look at Lovaas's studies, a lot of the behavior that Lovaas was trying to quote-unquote extinguish with punishment, etc., it's obvious that the behaviors were probably caused by the experimental situation, at least in part. So, it's really, Lovaas is another one of those black holes in my book that you can endlessly go down, and sort of.
It's a very, very depressing hole.
I know, it's a very, very depressing hole. The good news is this. So Bernie, once he teamed up with Lovaas, he thought, okay, ABA, this is good. So I now have something to offer parents. I don't just have this book that tells them that they're not to blame. I don't just have a number that they can call, because he would answer the phone all night, basically. If a parent who had read his book, found his number, he would talk to them. He was very good about that. But he said, okay, now I have this useful therapy that I can spread the word about. So on November 4th, 1965, Bernie and Ruth Chris Sullivan had the first meeting of the first organization for autism parents in America. Now, by this point, Bernie had already been to England, where he talked to Lorna Wing, who was the mother of the autism spectrum. She was the clinical psychiatrist who, as I believe I mentioned in the last broadcast, had rediscovered Asperger's paper, in a sense rediscovered the autism spectrum, and then worked with the editors of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, to broaden the criteria of diagnosis for autism to reflect the spectrum. So anyway, Bernie had already visited Lorna. Lorna had already launched the first parenting organization in London. There may have been another parenting organization in the Netherlands, I hear now. But anyway, this idea was an idea whose time had come. The idea that parents, by teaming up together, could share information, could also just offer each other emotional support. So on November 14th, 1965, in Teaneck, New Jersey, Ruth Chris Sullivan, had driven there for 4 hours, and they had the first meeting of autism parents in America. And it was a very interesting meeting because for all the parents there, it was an incredibly emotional experience. Because it was the first time, really, that they'd been able to talk to other autism parents without this, horrible burden of shame and stigma on them. It was a 4-hour meeting, and interesting things happened. Bernie gave a presentation on ABA. He would give that presentation many times over the years. But one of the things that I found for my book that I thought was so fascinating was that there was a pediatrician there named Mary Goodwin who demonstrated what was commonly called a talking typewriter. It was really a primitive computer called the Edison Responsive Environment Learning System. It was like so ahead of its time. It was unbelievable. There was like a keyboard. There was a monitor. If there was a kid using it, the kid would get voice prompts. Like it was basically, amazingly a piece of the future that had been sort of beamed back, to 1965. And so Mary had already figured out that this machine was great for autistic kids because it never punished them. It was always encouraging. They loved it. That was like an early sign that autistic people were attracted to technology. So Bernie gave his rap on ABA. Mary gave her demonstration of, what eventually we would all be doing, and certainly autistic people would be doing online, decades later. And so the parents left with a sense of hope. And basically on Bernie's book tour, more or less, he had these meetings of parents, and it was a revolution. It was huge because parents would no longer take the blame for causing their kids autism, and also they could share information. So when the parents' movement started out, it was a wonderful thing.
Now, of course, I like that's a wonderful segue, sir, because it was definitely a wonderful situation. The autistic parents had support and a place to share stories and discuss strategies around raising their kids. But then there were a number of rifts, shall we say. Now, around ABA was definitely one rift, but there were a number of others.
Well, more specifically than ABA, one of the first rifts was around punishment, because Lovaas and Rimland, I have to say, one of the things about my book is that, sometimes I'll be talking about my book to someone and they'll say, well, was so-and-so good or evil? Was Asper good or evil?
Right.
Or, was Connor good or evil? Or was Rimland good or evil? There's nobody purely good. It's not a binary book. There's nobody good, strictly good or evil, except for perhaps Lorna Wing, I have to say. I never detected any evil in her. Basically, everything that she did was good. And then there are a number of parents who I wrote about who I think are, sort of like super really good people. But in terms of this sort of big name clinicians and whatnot, almost everybody, did really great things and then pretty bad things.
Right.
And in the case of Bernie Rimland, the wonderful thing that he did was write this book, kill off that horrible idea that parents were responsible for autism, launch the parents movement with Ruth Chris Sullivan. But then, the problem is that he embraced Lovaas's vision of ABA so wholeheartedly that he also embraced Lovaas's use of punishment. And when I say punishment, I'm not using it in the usual sense. I'm using it in the technical, behaviorist, psychological sense.
The electrified floor.
Right,
sense.
exactly.
Right.
And so what Bernie actually tried, in not one of his kindest hours, I have to say, Bernie actually tried to popularize the use of industrial cattle prods at home. Like mothers were supposed to zap their kids when their autistic kids when they misbehaved, and to make it sort of more acceptable to parents, Bernie coined the euphemism "tingle sticks."
Oh my Lord!
And let's put it this way: there were some tough moms in New York who didn't roll that way. Like they were not going to be using any tingle sticks, on their kids. So one of the first rifts in the parenting movement was over the use of what behaviorists call punishment. And what anybody else would call torture, actually. And so, the parents were in a tough situation because the kids were sometimes injuring themselves so badly that alone, could be life-threatening even. But they just intuitively rejected Bernie's attempt to popularize punishment. I mean, some parents actually did it, but there was a lot of pushback against that. And in fact, what I think is so interesting is that even ABA, the assistant that Lovaas, sort of the graduate assistant that Lovaas would dispatch to Bernie's meetings of these parenting organizations, his name was David Rybach. I talked to him. He was actually astounded that I was able to track him down. He couldn't believe anyone, nobody had talked about this stuff for decades, but so he gave me this amazing interview. And David did not use punishment on the kids. At worst, he would slap himself, which would create this sort of startling sound that alone would act as, to extinguish the behavior that he was trying to extinguish. But basically, he refused to do what Lovaas was doing in the lab to the kids. So, Lovaas's desire to use these brutal punishments on these kids, it was almost immediately rejected. And then there was an article written in Life magazine about Lovaas, and it portrayed him as a hero. In fact, it called him a poet with a cattle prod. And there were these very alarming photographs of not just autistic kids looking sad, but also like experimenters screaming at the kids. And, Life magazine thought, oh, this is great. This is like these guys are pioneers at treating this, horrible, condition. But in fact, parents all over the country read that article and was like, no, this is terrible, So they would actually object once Bernie started talking about ABA at the meetings because they had read the Life magazine article. So anyway, one of the first riffs was about punishment, use of punishment. Then, Bernie, another way that I don't want to frame him negatively up front, but, what he really got into was the idea that he could cure autism. And he had a very good reason for believing this. There's a condition called phenylketonuria, which it's something that you're born with. It's genetic. And it means that you can't properly digest a certain amino acid. And so it builds up in your bloodstream and it eventually creates intellectual disability. So it's a very, very serious condition. But it turns out that it's not a very complex condition. So it turns out that if you do a special diet, the kid can actually grow up and not become intellectually disabled. So now they routinely test kids for PKU, as it's called, I believe in the maternity hospital. And so if the kid, has to be on a special diet, you already know up front, so you never give that kid the amino acid that they can't handle. So, Bernie thought that he would be able to find something similar for autism, like a dietary intervention or a biomedical intervention, vitamins. And Bernie was influenced in that regard by Linus Pauling. Do you remember who that was? He was the guy who basically said vitamin C could cure almost anything,
right?
And he was a brilliant guy. I believe he won like several Nobel prizes. Like seriously, like I believe he won the science. I have it in the book, but he won a Nobel Prize in.
Right.
Yeah, Nobel Prize in Science and also the Peace Prize, I believe, for his anti-nuclear activity. So, no question, Linus Pauling was a brilliant, visionary guy. About the vitamin C, maybe not so much. He wrote bestsellers about it. There was a run on vitamin C tablets that practically launched what we now call the alternative medical industry, was Linus Pauling's belief in vitamin C. Because suddenly, people they couldn't get vitamin C, at the drugstore. So like a whole health food store industry arose to provide them with, herbal supplements and alternative medicine. And so Bernie really pushed for biomedical interventions for autism. Now, I don't want to say that biomedical interventions are worthless, because as many parents have discovered, they're not. If a kid is gluten intolerant,
exactly,
and they can't say, "Mommy, I have a tummy ache," because they're autistic, so they can't use speech that way. Imagine having a tummy ache when you can't talk. So what would you do? You would act out. So it could be that there's a subset of kids. Nobody knows yet if it's a larger subset than a non-autistic group, but it could be there's a subset of autistic kids who can't handle gluten. And so if you cut gluten out of their diet, they'll feel better. When they feel better, they will not have to act out as much or not act in self-injurious ways. So I'm not like dismissing all this as quackery. The one aspect of Bernie's biomedical trip that was quackery was that he eventually claimed that you could cure autism with biomedical interventions. And it's just not true. Bernie would host these meetings, and there were meetings of, the parents group that he had launched. And kids who were allegedly cured from autism by these biomedical interventions would give speeches. And the problem is, if you look at them, it's obvious that they're still very autistic. It could be that they had, improved in certain areas of function. Kids do that for all sorts of reasons. One of the things that Bernie recommended was doing everything at once for the child. So a child might be getting ABA, they might be getting occupational therapy, they might be getting dietary interventions, they might be taking vitamins. The problem with that is that you are then running a very uncontrolled experiment on your child. And so if the child improves, was it the vitamin B? Was it the secretin, this pig hormone that Bernie was pushing, as allegedly a cure for autism? Was it, you could get it through the gray market? Bernie and the parenting organization practically created almost like a shadow medical establishment to provide alleged cures for autism to parents who were desperate. The parents would share all this information. Bernie had a newsletter. It was, for the most part, a very good thing because it gave parents a sense that there was progress going on in autism science. And in fact, there bloody wasn't, except for, a couple of places on Earth. Why? Because autism was mistakenly believed to be so rare. I actually read a paper by a psychiatrist, I think, in the 1970s that said something like, it basically apologized to the reader up front, like, I'm sorry to, sort of be wasting your time with this incredible niche condition. You'll never see it, in your practice, but here it is because it's kind of interesting, so that's how rare autism was, that researchers would apologize, for even writing papers about it. And so there was like very little progress being made. Plus, because the prevailing theories up to that point had been mostly, this crap, Freudian stuff about bad mothering. There was just no progress happening. But Bernie would, diligently collect all the information that he could about anything that might help autistic kids and put it in the newsletter. It was almost like a proto-internet, really. And so parents had a sense that, there was important work being done and that breakthroughs might be around the corner and, all that. And so, but eventually Bernie got so obsessed with the vitamins. He was really into, B vitamins, in particular magnesium. Like, he got so obsessed with his particular, alleged cures that were never tested against placebo. Like that, he didn't believe in placebo-controlled trials. He thought he had found better ways of running experiments, basically. So it was very hard for Bernie to separate out what was the natural course of development from what his, special remedies were doing. And so eventually some of the parents, including a guy who I just had dinner with actually a couple weeks ago, named Ed Ritvo, who was a real pioneer of biological autism research, not psychological, but biological, looking for biomarkers for autism. Ed was one of the first scientists in the world who did that. And he split with Bernie in the parents' organization over the issue of vitamins. Because Bernie was saying, from now on, anyone who wants to join our organization, we have to get a vow from them that they're giving their kids these vitamins, And Ritvo was like, no, we're not, the science is not solid on that. And we're not that kind of organization. We're here to offer support. And so that was another big rift. So,
you mentioned the cure over and over, a cure or treatment. And that's actually another rift that occurred is, should these parents groups be pursuing a cure for autism, or should they be sort of more aiming themselves towards creating supports that would help people with autism to lead better lives?
Right. And that was really present at the very first meeting, as I mentioned, in the distinction between ABA and the computer learning system, because Lovaas would eventually claim that his intensive ABA, and by intensive I mean like really intensive. In fact, I believe his phrase was all significant persons in all significant environments basically had to be involved in training the child using behaviorist techniques. So basically, the child was fully immersed among people who were constantly trying to train them to do the right thing. It was a very artificial situation. Who could afford that? It's but Lovaas disastrously, in the late 80s would eventually claim that he could, restore the kids to quote unquote normal functioning. And that was an exaggeration. People who've worked with him said that, it wasn't good science, but it sure landed him on the, in the New York Times. So, Lovaas basically, even though he sort of avoided the word cure. He used the word recovery from autism. And so a good glimpse of what recovery means is, think about this. You know who Temple Grandin is, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's like the most widely known autistic person on earth, probably, at this point. And she's a brilliant industrial designer. When she came out with her autobiography in the late 80s, Bernie wrote the foreword, and he called her a recovered autistic person. So he implied that she'd been cured. Why did he say that? Because an autistic person under, Bernie's criteria would not be capable of working at a university or having a degree or living independently. So obviously she was recovered.
Right.
But now it's like, Temple Grandin is not, neither the most nor the least autistic person I've ever met. She has autism. It's pretty unmistakable. But, to Bernie at that moment in history, she seemed to be recovered simply because she was an adult leading her own life. It's one of the things when I was talking to Ritvo, he pointed out that, something that actually really took me aback, which is that he published a paper in 1989. That's not that long ago, people. He published a paper in 1989 about autistic adults who were married and had kids. And it actually, it wasn't the most flattering paper. Like hardly any of them had been able to keep jobs, and they had a lot of problems. Even so, Ed Ritvo told me that his colleagues said that he was crazy for saying that autistic people could get married and have kids and even be adults. Like the existence of autistic adults was still a kind of controversial, thing. And so that's how recently and how radically things have changed our picture of autism from even 1989.
This is Science for the People, and I'm joined today by Steve Silberman, author of Neurotribes. And we'll be back with more after these messages.
Science for the People is a weekly radio show and podcast that explores everyday life from a scientific perspective. We are a member of the Skepchick Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on science and critical thinking. To find out where Science for the People airs near you, or to listen to past episodes, check out our website at scienceforthepeople.ca. You'll also find links to support us at Patreon, to connect with us on Facebook and Twitter, and to subscribe to the podcast in iTunes. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Science for the People. I'm Desiree Schell, and today we've brought author Steve Silberman back to talk a bit more about his book, Neurotribes. So I'm just wondering, where does this stand now? Where is the priority for parents groups? Is anybody still focused on finding a cure, or is it about making life more comfortable, or what's the goal?
Well, boy, is that ever a hot button issue. I've been talking a lot since the publication of my book about the need to build more support systems for families and more resources for autistic people as they become adults. Better job training programs, transitional programs to help them once they leave high school and have to move into the job market, mentorship programs, because one of the things that seems to really work for young autistic adults is to talk to older autistic adults and get tips from them on living. And that's something that only became possible in the recent historical era, because the very existence of autistic adults was denied, until the last couple of decades. So, basically, there is still now a very hot button controversy about whether or not most of the research should be focused on finding the cause of autism and then maybe finding a cure for autism. I think, finding a cure for autism, I have to say, I think it's a quixotic mission. Autism affects so many different systems in the body, perceptual systems. It is really very deeply a part of a person's identity. So, when I was a kid in high school, I came out as gay to my parents. And, they immediately, as most parents back then would have done, sent me to a therapist for the cure, and let's say it didn't work. I'm now a happily married gay man, and I remember it actually went pretty well, because I was talking to the therapist for a while, and I said, how much is this costing my parents? And she told me it was some unbelievable amount. And I said, do you think I really need this? And she was like, you seem perfectly happy and well adjusted to me. So she was actually a pioneer herself. But because homosexuality was still then listed as a mental illness, So anyway, now obviously it's not a completely parallel situation, because autism can present much more, basically with a gay person, if you stop beating them up and firing them and allow them to get married, they can be pretty happy.
Right.
So it's not an exact parallel, but for autistic people, if they can have the support that they need, they can lead happy autistic lives. People say, well, what about a cure? Like, we're not even close, And so what I've been saying since my book was published was that we should be devoting as much research to how to improve the lives of the autistic people already here as we are to investigating why they became autistic. And that's exactly what's not happening. For instance, a government report came out last year that showed that the total outlay on research in America on improving the lives of autistic adults, it was scandalously low. It was like 1% or something, and falling. It had been falling. And part of the reason why has been so little research into the lives of autistic adults is because of the idea that vaccines cause autism. And that created such a panic that it did focus a lot of energy onto the causes of autism. And it did produce, some good research that had nothing to do with vaccines, because vaccines do not, in fact, cause autism. But the problem is that it put us in a mindset where, society feels like it's only taking autism seriously if it researches the cause.
Right.
And there are probably multiple causes. And I would submit that society is not taking autism seriously until it supports autistic people and their families. And we're nowhere close to that.
Okay, now that brings me to something else I really want to talk about is, we've been primarily talking about kids, but can you talk a bit about adult self-advocacy around autism? Because I think that was another turning point.
Sure, absolutely. Well, remember that the concept of an autistic self-advocate is a relatively recent historical development. Because, as I mentioned, when, Temple Grandin came out with her biography, Emergence, she was, presented as a recovered autistic person. So the notion that someone might be adult, autistic, not recovered and okay, that's a very, very new idea. So basically what made that possible was the emergence of the internet. Because the internet turns out to be a very comfortable communication environment for people who have trouble parsing subtle signs in body language, making sense of facial expressions, responding to subtle social cues. When you're sitting behind your computer, you can take the time to compose your thoughts, even if you're unable to use oral speech. You can compose your thoughts on your own time and interact with other people. And I did some research into the very first autistic communities online. And what was so interesting to me was looking at, only the oldest people in your audience will remember this, but there used to be an area of the internet called Usenet, which was internet news groups. And so it was like places where people could talk about stuff that they were interested in, like the Grateful Dead or Doctor Who or whatever. So these communities of shared interests would spring up on something called Usenet. And in one of the first places that was built for, I believe it was the parents of disabled children, autistic people started appearing there, and they would ask each other, I was diagnosed with Connors syndrome, i.e. autism, when I was a child. Can Connors syndrome persist into adulthood? So they literally had to discover that they were still autistic by talking to each other and saying, yes, I think I still have Connors syndrome too. It's amazing to me that recently, people still had to sort of grope around in the dark and find out that they were still autistic and that there were other people like them and that they shared many of the same challenges in daily life. So once autistic people could start talking to each other, they started sharing the stories of their lives. And they found very quickly that there were many commonalities, that they struggled with many of the same things. As diverse as the autism community is, there were some themes that were very persistent. The other thing that happened was that a guy named Jim Sinclair, who had never been what you would call normal, he was born with the sexual characteristics of neither gender, and his parents raised him as a little girl, but he felt like a boy. And so his first act of rebellion was to jump off his father's lap when his father would call him a little girl. Anyway, he ended up figuring out that he was an adult autistic. He went down to UCLA and picked up the pamphlets and saw that they didn't really, describe his life accurately, because they described people with no empathy and, all the usual terrible, clinical cliches about autism. So Jim Sinclair started having meetings of autistic people at basically at conferences where autism was being discussed. And what they would do is they would stand up and say, well, actually, I'm autistic and it's not like that. Or, well, actually, I'm autistic and this is what it's like for me. So they started challenging the widely accepted stereotypes of autism by presenting themselves in their actual full humanity. And eventually what Jim and the other members of what was called the Autism Network International, what they figured out was that crowded conferences were not the best place for them to meet, because those conferences were like socially taxing even for non-autistic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, I can feel pretty autistic at conferences sometimes, even though I'm not. But what they did was they started having a series of events that were called Autreat, Autistic Retreat. And they were customized. The sensory environment of Autreat was customized for autistic people. So no flash, they would ask people not to put on perfume because autistic people can have hyperacute senses. I went to Autreat. It was one of the first things that I did for my book research. And it was absolutely one of the most crucial steps in my research, because I got to hang out with 70 autistic people at all levels of ability. Like there's this huge, temptation among parents, particularly, unfortunately, to dismiss autistic adults who advocate for themselves as quote unquote high functioning people who are not like my child. Well, the truth of the matter is, when many autistic self-advocates were young, they were like that child. In fact, Temple Grandin was like their child. Temple Grandin would, throw her poop and injure herself and do all the things that were, she got kicked out of many, many schools. So there's this belief that I believe is a myth that there are like two kinds of autism. There's the low functioning autism. That's the real autism, and then there's the high functioning autism that, it's not really autism, and it's just not true. There are in fact thousands of kinds of autism. There are as many kinds of autism as there are autistic people. And people's sort of position on, the functioning ladder, you can say, can change not only from year to year or from stage of life to stage of life, but from day to day. As my favorite way of putting that is, there's a woman in my book named Carol Greenberg who was the autistic mother of an autistic child. And she said, some days are more autistic than others. And what she means is that the challenges that she faces and that her son faces can change from day to day. So autistic self-advocates are now, we're sitting in the, I hate to overuse this word particularly because I used to write for Wired, the word revolution, it sort of became a cliche. We are in a revolution. And what is happening is that autistic self-advocates have now demanded a place at the table when the public policy that affects autistic people is set. And a very clear example of that is Hillary Clinton's autism plan. Now, I'm not going to get partisan here. I'm not going to tell anyone who to vote for. I'm just saying that Hillary Clinton's 2008 speech about autism was all focused on causes, and I don't know if she used the word cure, but it was, it was implicit in what she was saying. Her new plan is all about supporting autistic people and their families, and she didn't say anything about epidemic or cause or cure. It was about helping autistic people and their families get the support and services they need. Why? It's because somebody on her team listened to us autistic self-advocates and group like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN, which is the most prominent, I would say, autistic self-advocacy group in America. And they are really changing the conversation about autism in very positive ways.
Well, and actually, this is a good point for me to ask. So what can, neurotypicals, and I love that term, neurotypical, meaning persons who aren't on the spectrum.
Right. And keep in mind, like some people say, well, isn't that a slur? Isn't that a slur against non-autistic? No, it's hilarious.
I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful. Yeah.
So what can neurotypicals do to help facilitate a better life experience for the neurodiverse?
Well, in the workplace, you can, for one thing, you can widen your concept of what a good employee is. In many cases, even in technology, people say, well, what are we looking for? We're looking for good people. Well, autistic people tend not to be good people. They might be able to focus very, very intensely on a task for hours on end, which most neurotypical people can't do because they'd be gossiping at the water fountain or whatever. Make room for different kinds of skills and different ways of thinking, and also different ways of experiencing the world. For instance, there's been a trend in recent years towards open offices where, you just have these cubicles and everybody has their, little action figures in their cubicles, but it's basically a big room with lots of noise and, everybody walking around. That's not so good, for an autistic person. An autistic person might be better off in a closed office. Many autistic, it's a matter of customizing the environment in subtle ways so that people who experience the world differently can be comfortable. For instance, many autistic people are bothered by fluorescent lights. They hear them buzz, like even if a neurotypical person can't hear it, they hear it. So if they need an overhead light, perhaps you could investigate having different areas of lighting in the office. There are many ways that we can customize our environment for people who experience the world differently and think differently. And what I find is that when you change the world so that it's better for disabled people, you often end up creating a better world for everyone. A really good example of that is curb cuts. That was originally invented for wheelchair users. What parent pushing a stroller isn't grateful that there's a curb cut at the corner, so that they don't have to jostle the stroller?
I personally would like to thank autism advocates for creating quiet rooms at conferences. I value those highly. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. And people now at the gym can read the news from their treadmill on the TV screen because of an accommodation made for people who are deaf, and nobody thought maybe someday there'll be gyms where people want to read about Donald Trump's latest outrage while they're on the treadmill, but it ends up, when you make the world better for people who are different than you end up making the world better for even you. What I would say is that the future of certainly one area of autism research is to investigate ways to adapt curricula in schools, because now that we have digital tablet devices, we can present the same core curriculum in different ways that are suited to the individual learning styles of each student. So if one student is, a better text-based learner, then they can read. If another student is a better audio-based learner, then they can listen to the lesson. And we now, because of the advent of digital technology, really, have made it possible to customize many aspects of our daily experience in ways that are better suited to people who think differently. One of the points at which I had to really wonder about the anti-vaccine people is that I read on a very famous blog that I will not mention, but it's one of the most prominent anti-vaccine blogs. And the editor was writing about that she had heard that the local library was launching a quiet room for autistic kids so that they could go there and chill out and, not have to deal with a lot of noise while they were reading at the library. She was outraged by this. Why? Because it normalizes autism. She thinks we should be instead working on the cure, only, no quiet rooms for autistic kids, because then, you'll think autism is okay. I'll tell you, I just can't wrap my mind around that, really. It's like we have to start taking care of the people who are here already.
Steve, you are lovely, and we never get to all the questions that I
I'm sorry.
have. Thank you so much for coming back. And everyone, go buy the book. Go buy the book. And that was Steve Silberman, author of Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. We've linked to it on our site at scienceforthepeople.ca. That's it for us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Science for the People. Science for the People is produced by Rochelle Saunders and edited by Ryan Bromsgrove. Helen Quivalon is our publishing liaison. We get research help from Josh Witten. Coordination and additional behind-the-scenes support comes from the enthusiastic Skepcheck Network team. Our theme song was written and recorded by Fractal Pattern, and its title is Binary Consequence. Science for the People is listener-supported. You can find us on Patreon, where you can support us with monthly donations in any amount. In return, we regularly post special patron-only extra content and after-show casual conversations with guests. This show is created in partnership with the Skeptic Network, a collection of blogs, podcasts, and video content focusing on the intersection of science, popular culture, politics, and social justice. You can find out more about Skeptic at skeptic.org. The show is hosted by Rochelle Saunders and me, Desiree Schell.